2,000 years later. 6.5 hours later. Day 2, day 3, day 4. A few moments later. 3 days later. 12 seconds later. 3:28 a.m. 3 weeks later. Many months later. Tomorrow. 12 o'clock midnight. 1 hour later. 2 hours later. 3 hours later. 2 hours later. 8:01 p.m. The next day. Later. 20 minutes later. 6 hours later.
70 years later.
6 hours later. 6 months later. 2 hours later. 1 minute 37 seconds later. 8 hours later. 3 hours later. The next day, 10 seconds later. 346 minutes later. Much later. 3 days later. Opening night. Later. 3,000 years later. 1 week later. 7:59 a.m. 3 weeks later. 3 days later. 2 hours later. 48 hours later. 8 hours later. 5 minutes later. 24 hours later. Much later. Much later. 7 hours later. A few minutes later. 2 hours later. 3 days later. 15 minutes later. 2 hours later. Much later. Yesterday. Many hours later. 75 years later. 2 hours later. 3 hours later. Later. Just then. 1 hour later. 5 hours later. 2 days later. Early the next morning. 2 weeks later. 11 minutes later. 5 minutes later. 24 hours later. 1 week later. 2 hours later. The next morning. The next morning. The very next evening. 1 hour later. The next day. Later. The next morning. Graduation day.
1 hour later.
5 minutes later. Soon after. Later. Moments later. The next morning. A little later. 3 hours later. 1 season later. 6 months later. The next day.